Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are going on a fascinating journey, really. We're tracing a single, powerful ideological current.
It's quite a direct line, too.
It is. It flows right from the merchant houses of the 17th century Dutch Republic and, 100 years later, crashes right into the American and French revolutions.
It's really the origin story of modern radicalism. And, our sources make it so clear just how fundamental those ideological battles fought in the Netherlands really were. They basically set the blueprint
A blueprint for what, exactly?
for this permanent duality we still see in political thought. I mean, the conflict between, say, localized secular authority on one side and centralized, often religiously backed power on the other.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, isn't it? To understand the specific environment of that Dutch laboratory.
Yes, and how it created the philosophical tools. Well, chiefly Spinoza's radical ideas that eventually powered this whole age of global revolution.
So we have to keep that central tension, that duality in mind as we go.
Absolutely. On one side, you got the forces of decentralization.
Yeah.
Think wealthy merchant elites, the city council.
The regents.
The regents, exactly. The political leaders who insisted on local sovereignty. They represent what would become the radical Enlightenment.
And on the other side, their constant opposition, the forces of centralization. So the powerful stadholderate, the military leadership, the orthodox religious faction.
All of them pushing for a stronger central government. And that mirrors the principles of the later moderate Enlightenment.
So we're pulling from texts covering early Dutch history, Spinoza's philosophy, and then the American and French revolutions. Okay, let's start at the beginning. The Dutch laboratory. Why the Netherlands? Why Holland specifically in the 17th century? I mean, it seems a bit strange that a huge economic crisis is what built the foundation for political liberty.
That's the crucial point, though. It wasn't some grand plan. It was geographic necessity.
Yeah.
Holland became this political experiment because of a massive demographic and economic shift.
You mean the population density?
Well, look at the sheer density, yes. Holland had this incredibly high percentage of its population living in towns. I mean, way higher than anywhere else in Europe, even more than wealthy regions like Flanders.
And that just kept increasing because the land itself was literally failing.
Precisely. Starting around the late 15th century, the sources describe a real crisis. Land reclamation just stops, and the land they already have starts sinking. The floods were catastrophic.
So you can't grow crops.
You can't sustain arable farming anymore, no.
Yeah,
So it forces them into the towns.
right.
They switch to dairy farming, which needs fewer workers, and this is key. They have to start importing cheap Baltic grain to feed everyone.
Which means you need traders, ports, you need cities.
Exactly. You need a robust international trading network based in those cities. So while the rest of Europe is sort of stagnating, Holland's population is pouring out of the countryside and into these booming urban centers.
So this wasn't an ideological movement to start. It was a geographical problem that creates this whole new class of people, this highly urbanized, financially powerful group that became the regent elite.
And they moved fast to make sure their political power matched their economic might. By the mid-15th century, this regent patriciate had consolidated total control over civic life.
How did they do that?
The key was shutting out any kind of popular democratic element, the old elector colleges, the guilds.
Ah,
So instead of a popular election, the big town officials were just chosen by the town council itself. It ensured the same merchant families held power generation after generation.
and that consolidation of urban, decentralized power, that creates a political fault line almost immediately. We see it during the Dutch Revolt itself in the 1570s and 80s.
That's the fundamental duality that William the Silent had to deal with. He knew he was leading two very different statecrafts. One north of the rivers, Holland and Zeeland, dominated by these commercial cities, and a totally different one to the south.
And the North had the money.
The north, and especially Holland, had the economic leverage to consolidate control over all the other northern provinces. They essentially set themselves up as the dominant voice in the Republic.
But that dominance was always going to be challenged, which brings us to, I guess, the next phase. The struggle for control, the centralized power, the stadholderate, wasn't just going to let Holland run the show.
Absolutely not. And our sources point to 1618 as the real inflection point. Moritz coup.
The military takeover.
He was. The act effectively transferred executive power away from the civilian, decentralized states of Holland
Yeah.
and put it right in the hands of the stadtholder, the central military authority.
And that was followed by a political purge, right? They
Oh,
went through the provinces and replaced local officials who were loyal to the state.
with managers loyal to the central military religious faction.
Yes.
And this forced the decentralized states' party people like DeWitt to come up with a constitutional justification for their position.
Which was that each of the 7 provinces was sovereign, a claim our sources just flatly call a manifest fiction. I mean, that's a really strong phrase. Help us break that down. Why would you maintain what is essentially a political lie?
It's a great question because everyone knew the truth. Decisions in the States General were made by majority vote. But here's the thing. That majority only mattered if Holland was in it.
Because they paid for everything.
They paid for most of it. They had the biggest population. Holland held the real veto power.
So if they had the real power, why bother with the fiction of sovereignty?
It was a constitutional shield. They had to insist on that fiction to retroactively reject the legitimacy of Montesquieu in 1618 and then William II's actions in 1650. Both had forcibly overruled Holland. If the state's general majority could legitimately overrule Holland, then the stadtholder's actions were defensible. So by insisting that Holland was a sovereign nation unto itself, any act by the central authority to overrule it was, by definition, an act of tyranny.
So they're fighting for the supremacy of local power against central executive action. It's high-stakes stuff.
And it wasn't just political. It was profoundly religious. The Reformation didn't create unity in the Low Countries. It led to lasting fragmentation.
And the way that religious feeling was distributed is really telling.
It is. Catholic allegiance was strong in the South, but in the North it was much weaker, except, interestingly, in pockets of Holland and Utrecht.
Why there?
Because those were the exact areas where the civilian, decentralized local governments had more liberal policies toward missionizing. They care less about doctrinal purity and more about, well, commercial stability.
So the liberal political wing matched up with a more tolerant religious view.
It did. But here's the crucial complication. The populace, the common people in the towns, often fiercely supported the strict Calvinist orthodoxy.
The religious wing of the centralizing stadtholderate.
Exactly. Which meant that these liberal secular town councils often faced civil unrest from their own citizens demanding stricter enforcement of religious doctrine. We see this in towns like Alkmaar and Kuda. The common folk were often the most powerful grassroots force opposing the liberal elite.
So we have this high-pressure cooker, an urban elite fighting a central military authority, complicated by a populace that often sides with the religious orthodoxy against their own local leaders.
And that brings us to the ultimate intellectual weapon developed in this environment, the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza.
His theological political treatise, TTP.
Published in 1670. And it wasn't just a philosophical argument. It was a political blueprint disguised as theology. It was an unparalleled challenge to all existing authority, monarchical, military, or clerical.
It was so inflammatory that opponents wouldn't even name the author. They just called it a certain blasphemous book. What made Spinoza so much more dangerous than, say, Thomas Hobbes? Hobbes was also advocating for a kind of radical secularism.
Hobbes was politically subversive, sure, but Spinoza was seen as socially reformist. He was a profound threat to the very idea of mixed government and monarchy. Hobbes, you see, still allowed for a separation between the body and the soul, between the human and the divine.
And Spinoza just collapses that entire framework.
Completely. His scheme was to eliminate the supernatural, entirely. He insisted that God and nature are identical, one substance. And this is where he just flatly contradicts Descartes.
No free will.
No freedom of the will, no ghost in the machine. Everything. Physical objects, human thoughts, political systems, it all follows the same fixed, eternal, and uninterrupted set of mechanical rules. God isn't some puppet master. God is the clockwork.
That sounds incredibly deterministic, almost bleak. If everything is fixed, how can that possibly be the foundation for political freedom and democratic revolution?
And that's the genius of his political theory. He argued that the real goal of the state isn't just to keep people safe from each other, like Hobbes believed. It's to enable people to live freely and satisfyingly, to maximize their individual potential within that deterministic system.
So freedom for Spinoza is understanding the rules and then acting in harmony with them.
Exactly. And the best way to understand and apply those fixed rules is through democracy. Because he argued democracy is inherently superior. Government should be run by large councils, where power is spread as widely as possible. The more minds you apply to a problem, the better the solution will reflect and serve the common good, which for him is just the rational, natural order of the universe.
This sounds like the perfect philosophical weapon for that decentralized anti-clerical elite in Holland.
It was their true manifesto. And Spinoza saw this change not as a violent upheaval, but as a slow, veiled process of intellectual infiltration, ideas defeating tyranny.
The authorities certainly saw the threat. They tried to stop it, but it seems like their attempts just backfired.
Spectacularly. In 1674, the states of Holland issued a strong placard banning the TTP. But it was way too late. The ban didn't contain the ideas. It just accelerated their clandestine penetration across Europe.
It became an underground bestseller.
It did. The TTP became this secret text, fusing with radical intellectual movements in France. This banned book became the intellectual bedrock of the entire radical Enlightenment.
And then we jump forward a century, and that bedrock starts to become visible. The American Revolution kicks off, and unlike the Dutch founding, this one resonates globally.
Because by the 1770s, the Enlightenment had pervaded society generally. Spinoza's philosophical errors weren't hiding in academic circles anymore. Their ideas were in pamphlets, newspapers, coffee houses. The debate was ready to become political action.
And we see that original Dutch duality, centralized authority versus decentralized freedom, playing out directly in the American founding.
The split is unmistakable. You have the moderate Enlightenment stream, venerating Locke and Montesquieu. They wanted stability, checks and balances, the British model of mixed government. That's the core Federalist position.
And then you have the radical Enlightenment stream, which is a direct descendant of Spinoza.
Championing secularism, democratic republicanism, and universal equal human rights.
So the Jeffersonians.
The Jeffersonians, fueled by people like Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin. And this wasn't just abstract philosophy. This duality drove the relentless and vicious polemics between the Federalists and Jeffersonians all through the 1790s. The argument was over the very nature of the republic.
And then the challenge they faced even had this ironic constitutional parallel to the Dutch Republic they were trying to improve on.
It's incredible. Our sources highlight that the pre-1787 American Confederation suffered from the exact same core weaknesses as the Dutch States General. An inability to raise taxes directly, and incomplete control over war and foreign policy because the federal body relied on the individual states agreeing.
So the U.S. founders learned directly from that Dutch flaw.
The new U.S. Constitution fixed that manifest fiction problem. It crucially enabled federal acts to be immediately effective without requiring every state to concur. They created a truly unified federal system, something the Dutch Republic never managed.
But the truly radical inheritance from Spinoza was that commitment to secularism among the revolutionary leaders. I mean, so many of them, Franklin, Paine, Jefferson, were privately Unitarians, deists, or non-believers.
Freeing the individual from the control of the church wasn't a secondary goal for them. It was indispensable. They saw separating church and state, widening toleration, as absolutely essential for the new republic to even function.
It's the same battle.
It is the same ideological commitment that the States Party in Holland waged against the Orthodox Calvinist preachers a century earlier. The same battle, just on a global stage.
So what's the takeaway here? We've traced this core idea of modern political radicalism all the way from geographical necessity creating Holland's merchant class.
They're the constitutional battles for provincial sovereignty against the stadtholderate.
And then to Spinoza, who provided the ultimate secular democratic justification for that decentralized model. And that intellectual dynamite just lay hidden until it exploded in the 18th century as the radical Enlightenment.
It's a continuous, uninterrupted line of ideological conflict. It pits the belief in rational, decentralized power and universal rights against the forces demanding hierarchy, centralization, and often a divine justification for their rule. The source of that tension is ancient, but the modern philosophical tools to fight it were forged in 17th century Amsterdam.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. The architects of this radical Enlightenment, people like Joel Barlow and Thomas Jefferson, they were obsessively concerned about whether the republic they created could even survive.
They were. They argued that without a system of democratic, compulsory, and non-theological education for every single young person, the representative system would inevitably fail.
Why? What was their great fear?
Their great fear was that without that universal enlightenment, the gap in knowledge between average citizens and their elected leaders, their chiefs as they put it, would grow too vast. They believed that information disparity would eventually cause representation to degenerate into just an instrument of elite control.
So think about that today. Given the vast amount of specialized, technical, and often deliberately fragmented information we all face, how deep does that original requirement for universal, secular, compulsory education run for us to maintain a truly functioning republic?